Today we're going to take a look at the work of T.C. Steele and see how he creates atmosphere and depth in his painting. Today we're taking a look at how to create atmosphere and depth in your painting, and we'll be taking a look at the artwork of Theodore Clement Steele, or T.C. Steele. This is he and his wife here. He was born in 1847, died in 1926. Probably the leading impressionist landscape painter at the turn of the century. He was also founding member, or leading artist at least, in the Indiana's Hoosiers group of painting, which is a great group of artists to study. Probably the best group of artists you've never heard of. Really good, really worth looking at. But TC attended art school in Cincinnati and Chicago for a short time before getting married and coming back to Indiana and kind of eking out a living painting portraits and painting signs. But he had a small group of patrons, I guess he did portraits for, that he talked them into supporting he and his wife. And he went to Munich for 5 years and studied at the Munich School of Art there. Now, the Munich School of Art is dark. It's very highly contrasted value-wise, strong darks and lights, and very muted color. It kind of lacks atmosphere as far as color goes, but a lot of atmosphere as far as maybe value goes to some degree. But a lot of black on the palette. Now, later on, as Impressionism kind of spread its way through the Midwest, his palette lightened, and he really creates strong atmosphere and depth. And what we're looking at is 4 ways, or 4 things you want to remember as you're trying to create atmosphere or depth. Because remember, our canvas is flat. It's 2-dimensional, and we want to create the illusion of 3 dimensions in there. So it's not just a matter of accurately copying what you see. I think we have to push these 4 things to create more atmosphere or depth in our painting. And the first one is value contrast, which he gets here in the older painting. You know, the strong darks in the foreground, the light values in the background. That contrast of dark and light creates some depth in there. Same thing here. Values get lighter. The trees gradually get lighter as they recede. So that's the value contrast. And you can see it here as well. The shadows in the foreground are darker than the shadows in the background. And it's not so much that all the background shadows just have to be lighter. There has to be that contrast, that comparison of background shadows with the foreground shadows. Because I can have my background shadows real light, like he has here in the distant hills. But if my foreground shadows aren't a lot darker, there's not going to be that contrast. So it's the contrasting values getting lighter as they go back. Same thing here, you can see the values getting lighter. The second one is color temperature. And by color temperature, I mean we have colors that we use. All our colors come from the color wheel. You have the cool side of the color wheel where everything has some kind of blue in it. Blue, blue-violet, red-violet, blue-green, even green to some degree. They all have blue in them, and they're cooler. And then the warm is everything that's more yellow-oriented. Yellow, orange, yellow-green. Those are the warmer colors. Warmer colors come forward. That's why you see the yellow-greens in front. And then they gradually turn cooler as they recede. So in the background, all you're left with, same thing here, is a lot of blue. Even though you might have orange trees in the background, they're going to be affected with blue. And the shadows turn really blue. Whereas in the foreground, you're going to have a lot of warmer colors. Even in the shadows, they're going to be a bit warmer than they are in the background, or a lot warmer than they are in the background. And number 3 is color saturation. And you're going to have stronger, more saturated colors in front. You can see here he's got the yellow trees. That's the strongest color. Even the color in the shadow the orange shrubbery there, that's very saturated, very strong, warm color. And then as the colors recede, you can see there's orange trees way in the background in those purple hills and trees way in the background, but they're very, very muted. The color saturation contrast, the contrast of higher saturation in the foreground and less saturation in the background. Again, it's not so much of just making your colors more muted in the background. It's that in the foreground, they're going to be that much stronger compared to the background. So it's always a comparison. And lastly, detail contrast. Pick out one here that's a bit more detailed in the foreground. Here's one here. He's got a lot more going on in the foreground than in the background. You know, the rocks in the creek, the value changes in the creek. And by details, I mean value changes. There's a lot more value changes in this foreground, and they gradually get less as they go back until the distant bluish hills, there's not much value contrast or detail at all in the background. So number 1 is value contrast. 2 is color temperature contrast. 3 is color saturation contrast. And number 4 is detail contrast. But coming back early on, again, a lot of black on the palette. It's a nice figure here. But again, very limited palette of just probably black and earth yellow and an earth red. Nice atmosphere, though, as far as the value goes. You can see the darkest darks are in the front trees and the dark accents in the front. And then they gradually get lighter as they go back. It does have a little color temperature in that the foreground has very muted warm color and the background has very muted, somewhat cool color in the distant trees. But not much color temperature change in there or contrast. Same thing with the color saturation. The background colors are just as muted as the foreground colors. Might be a little more saturation in the foreground lights in there, but not much. So he's not using much there, but he does change. It's gradually changing. I saw this painting in Indiana at a museum. A little more color saturation, a little more blue color in the black in the background. Kind of a bluish black trees. Really nice atmosphere though. That early morning haze or fog captures it really well. I don't know if this doesn't look like Indiana. Looks more like Germany, but is capturing a bit more with the color temperature here as well as the value temperature. And of course, in the background, virtually no value contrast or detail to speak of. And in the foreground has a lot more detail. So those 4 things combined really help create that atmosphere and depth. Not a lot of atmosphere here, but you can see he's starting to use more color. And the idea of the value contrast. The foreground and middle ground darks are a lot darker. And then as they recede, these shadows disappear and get a lot lighter. And that, again, that creates separation in those, the foreground, middle ground, background areas of your painting. And that's going to create more depth. Also, the less detail, hardly any detail in the background. And again, detail is when you have a little or a lot of small dark and light value changes. And he has a lot of that in the foreground, but not in the background. And that separates that foreground, middle ground, background a lot more. It makes it feel like you can step into the painting and walk into the background. And that's what you want. And I think we're so used to photographs, the idea that, we take a photograph and look at it and we see the photograph as reality, but the photograph does not pick up that value contrast as well as standing there and seeing the real thing. So we really, especially working from references, we have to push the shadows, the darker values lighter as they recede, the lighter values and colors more muted and cooler, and keep the foreground darks darker and the color more saturated, especially in the light. Nice atmosphere here. You can see in the background, there's no detail. I mean, we know it's trees back there because of the trees in the foreground. It's just in relation, we can tell that's a hillside with trees on it, but you can't see the trees. And again, the darkest darks are up front. This is more of a high key painting. The darks aren't very dark and the lights are really, really light. So you can have a high key painting where all your values are the right relationship, but they're lighter. Or you can have a low key painting where all the values are right, the relationship between them, but they're all a lot darker. And he's getting more and more color here, a lot of A lot of more pure colors, more yellows, reds, pure blues, and greens and purples probably. And not so much the earth colors, although it looks like there's some, but a lot of the browns now are probably mixed with blue, red, and yellow as opposed to burnt sienna and black. It was really nice painting. Those blue hills in the background really shoot back there. And I imagine, and he painted outside a lot, so I imagine he saw more color and maybe more contrast in those background hills, but just making them a blue really shoots them back in the distance, creates a lot of depth. Another nice one here, really strong autumn, obviously. Really strong yellow, yellow oranges, yellow greens in the foreground. Even the shadows have a pretty strong orange there, dark orange, and that pulls the foreground forward. And the lack of color saturation or strong color in the background makes those trees recede back. Now, the violet he has in the background trees is a fairly strong violet, but it stays in the background because it's cool and not as saturated as the foreground. And that's that contrast, the idea that if I want the background to look lighter and recede back, I have to make the foreground darks darker than the background darks. Without that contrast, you don't have the depth. Because I see a lot of artists will just add a lot of blue to the background, thinking that's automatically just going to give them distance. But if you don't have the foreground in contrast being a lot warmer, you won't have as much depth. So you have to pull the foreground forward as well as the background backward. It's a real nice one. Again, kind of that Midwest haze you get usually in August or July instead of in the autumn. A lot of real nice depth back there. You can see the background hills. I don't remember Indiana having hills like that, but you have two layers of hills back in there, and he creates that atmosphere between them by getting the background hills a lot lighter and cooler. In the foreground hill, or that middle ground hill that comes in front, it's cool also, but not as cool. You can see the orange and red orange kind of scrubbed into it a little bit. And that pulls it forward slightly from the background hill. And the odd still life once in a while, where you still have to create depth, having your darkest darks in the foreground and in this blue pot here as more of the focal point. And the background, very unsaturated. The strongest colors are the objects up front, the blue bowl and the red, I don't know what those are, red berries. Orange, red orange. Here he's really pushing it, really a clean blue in the background. Now these trees in the background are an orange, but they stay in the background because the tree in the foreground, or the trees and shrubbery in the foreground, are a lot stronger orange. So you can have warm colors in the distance. They just have to be affected with a cooler color. Blue, blue, violet, violet. And I can have cool colors in the foreground. They're just going to be a little more affected with some warmer colors to pull them forward. The nice one here, again, more little dark and light changes in the foreground. Some more detail in the foreground and middle ground, a lot less detail in the background. And that atmosphere created with the value first, the real dark tree on the right, the shadows under the tree, and shadows as they recede and go back are a lot lighter, and then the shadows disappear. You're not going to see as much shadow in the background. And if you do, there won't be as much contrast. Now here's a backlit scene. And when you have backlighting, where in other words the sun is in front of you, you're going to have a lot more depth because the sun that filters through in front is going to simplify and flatten hills and trees as they recede and go back in the background, so that his trees in the background, in the very distant background as well, are very flat, very simple, hardly any value change. They're just a kind of a light, dark, very cool, and they just stay back there. And that allows the trees in the middle ground and the stuff in the foreground to be more detailed. So if he had added more detail in those distant trees and hill, the foreground trees would not have stood out at all. They would have just blended into the detail in the background, And he does that a lot. Now, here's more of a close-up of a painting. This was a painting I saw in Indiana also. And the full image of the painting didn't turn out, but this kind of zoom in of the detail did. And here you can see how much he's really pushing the blue in the background. The blue, blue-violet, blue-green in the hills, and the yellow, yellow-orange, and orange in the trees in the foreground are really coming forward. The other thing is the thick paint. All these guys in the Indiana group used really heavy paint. Now, I imagine they built it up, starting out thin just to get everything covered and get the right relationships. And I don't know if they used palette knife to pile on the paint, but it looks a little bit like palette knife. And then using the brush to kind of drag through it. But value-wise, all the darks are gradually getting lighter. And then color temperature-wise, all the colors are gradually getting cooler. There is some orange in the background hills, but it's so affected by the blue and blue-violet, you don't really notice it as orange. But it does read as distant orange trees because that blue, blue-violet kind of takes over. Now this scene is, the light is coming from the front pretty much, or behind the viewer, a little to the right side. And that kind of flattens things a little bit, not as much depth. So if you're outside taking photographs or you're outside painting, wherever I'm looking to paint or take photographs, if the sun is directly behind me, it's going to flatten a little bit like this does. The hill is a little flatter. There's not as much value change. There's not as much temperature change either. Not like there is here where the sun is in front. Then these background trees get a lot cooler. They lose their warm temperature. And that's what happens when the sun is in front of you or in the sides in front of you. But if it's behind you, it can kind of flatten things out. Now, it's still a beautiful painting, but it does lose the depth because there's not much difference in the color back in here from the color in here. Now, you could push it. You could make the hill a lot bluer, a bluish green. Well, still oranges in it, but affect all the colors with a little more blue or blue-violet. But generally speaking, the landscape does flatten when the sun is directly behind you. And here the sun is more to the side. You can see the trees are being hit on the right side and the shadow is on the left side. When the light source is on the side, you get a lot more atmospheric conditions. So when the sun is in front or the side, you're going to get more atmosphere in what you see. But when it's behind you, again, it's going to flatten out a little more. Here the sun is on the right side, shadows are falling, going towards the left. But that creates a lot more atmosphere in the background mountains. It doesn't flatten. But your darkest darks are up here. Even your shadows in the foreground, shadows are cooler, but he keeps the foreground shadows warmer and then the background shadows almost blue. And that creates that depth. That's that contrast of warmer lights and darks in the foreground and cooler lights and darks in the background. But it's a gradual value change. In the darkest here, then a little lighter in the middle ground, in the background, and in the farthest background is lighter yet, value-wise. And don't forget the detail. The detail's not way up front in this painting because there's not much going on there, but it is on the trees on the right. That's your most detail. And then the trees gradually get more and more simple as they recede. Now this one doesn't have much depth at all. It's kind of a close-up painting. It's his wife painting. They built a studio out in the country, and she had all these beautiful gardens around it. So he did some great paintings there. I just like his color in this one. Really light palette, using more pure colors. No black anymore. Now this one is one of the other artists in the Hoosier group, John Otis Adams. They went to Munich together, their families, and always painted together. But you can see the atmosphere here. And this has all of it. Has the detail in front, and the background has hardly any detail. Has the color temperature warmer. The colors are a lot warmer in front, even though there's some cool colors in front. Those cool colors are affected by orange or yellow-orange. And then the background colors are all more on the blue side. Everything is affected by blue, if not just almost straight blue in the background. And then the details in the foreground, and also the color saturation is a lot more in the foreground, and the colors get more muted in the background. Remember, you want 4 different types of contrast to create depth. You want value contrast, color temperature contrast, color saturation contrast, and detail contrast.